Literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today is the second episode of my Why We Read Fiction series. In this series, I am exploring the topic of why we read fiction, as opposed to other forms of entertainment or means of gathering information, as opposed to nonfiction books, as opposed to just watching TV or just reading the news or just watching movies. Why do we come back to fiction again and again? And I want to take a step back from where I landed in my first episode. To be completely honest, that first episode, was my maiden voyage for the idea of this series and executing the concept. And what really happened was I sat here in front of my camera and did a nearly 40-minute book review of Living by Fiction by Annie Dillard. Whereas what I intended to do was to just take one or two points that I got from that book and use those as the point of departure for a very short 5 to 10 minute talk. So that's what I'm going to try to do a better job at in this video, accepting this little preamble I'm giving you right now. I want to keep these videos short and concentrated. One of the points here is, like I said in my first video of 2023, I want to cut down on exacerbating the compulsion to continue to keep buying books and not have time to get around to reading them. So the point of the series is not to compel you to buy books, but to think and talk with me about why we read fiction in the first place. I should also back up and make it clear that I'm not after the typical reasons that are given. The typical reasons given for reading fiction are, of course, improving your imagination, improving your creativity, also expanding your vocabulary, expanding your knowledge of certain things, increasing and deepening your empathy, the ability to empathize with many different people. These are among the most common reasons given, and they're all extremely accurate and valid. However, I'm after something perhaps a bit more elusive. And so with all that out of the way, today I want to talk about a couple of points that come from this beautiful little compendium of C.S. Lewis's nonfiction writing that is relevant to why we read, The Reading Life. Regardless of what you may think of C.S. Lewis, the man, the thinker, the theologian, he is, in the end, a wonderful storyteller and articulator of complex thought and, well, a reader. He simply loves to read. He understands this deep desire and compulsion to read fiction. He understands it so much that in one of his essays, he says that a true bookworm, a true reader, highly values reading as an activity and not as a last resort. And he makes this claim that is so true. When they, the true readers, are denied such attentive and undisturbed reading, even for a few days, they feel impoverished. But the first 2 points I want to focus on for today's episode of Why We Read Fiction come from his experiment in criticism, where he says, the man who is contented to be only himself, and therefore less a self, is in prison. And then he leads into literary experience heals the wound without undermining the privilege of individuality. This is a complex thought compressed in such rhetoric as I only really get from Lewis's nonfiction. Of course, the first claim is well known to us and gets at that reason for reading literature that says, it deepens our empathy because it opens our mind to all kinds of other people out there and the things they may be going through. Thus, the man who is contented to be only himself, meaning I'm not going to take time to try to experience things through other people's minds and eyes, is therefore less a self. Now, wait a second. What does that mean? Less a self. If I'm continued to be only myself, how am I less a self? Well, because Lewis is saying that in order to enlarge the self and to be more than just myself, it includes opening my mind to all of the other selves that I can. Otherwise, as Lewis puts it, we're in a prison of ourself. And thus, that thought, that literary experience, sitting and reading fiction, and thus experiencing the world through someone else's imagination, is healing that wound of my individuality, my self-contained existence. But Lewis makes the gorgeous distinction that reading in this way, reading fiction in this way, doesn't undermine the privilege of my individuality. Thus, reading fiction is a way of healing a wound that individuality has caused, where we are each of us more and more isolated, more and more felt to be on islands. But it doesn't take away the special privilege of being an individual with a unique consciousness. Really just a beautiful thought. Because oftentimes I think people can look at those of us who get lost in fiction after fiction as having our head in the clouds, or, some fanciful and frivolous activity, when in fact what we are doing is both healing ourselves of being isolated while at the same time improving ourselves, celebrating our individuality by not replacing our self with all of these other selves, but enlarging the self by appending all these other selves. This can also lead into arguments where people say, oh, your head is in fiction all the time, your head's in the clouds, you are trying to completely escape reality, and you're no longer in touch with reality. You're just in this cartoon fantasy land. As the writer of the Chronicles of Narnia, Lewis dealt with this kind of opposition a lot. And this is how he dealt with it. This is beautiful. It would be much truer to say that fairyland arouses a longing for he knows not what, for something the reader can't quite put their finger on. It stirs and troubles him to his lifelong enrichment, with the dim sense of something beyond his reach, and far from dulling or emptying the actual world, gives it a new dimension of depth. He does not despise real woods because he has read of enchanted woods. The reading makes all real woods a little enchanted. This may be one of the most gorgeous statements about and arguments for reading fiction I've ever heard. But let's back up. It really stands out to me that Lewis says that reading fiction arouses a longing for something in the reader that they can't name. So again, we're pressing up against this ineffable, elusive entity. Lewis says that bumping up against this troubles the reader to his or her lifelong enrichment. With the dim sense of something beyond our reach, there's something that is compelling we fiction readers that gives a new dimension of depth to the experience of reality, to our lives, but which we can't even really explain. Or perhaps we can. And I think that in episode 3, when I talk about Proust on reading and Peter Schwanger's idea of reading's residue, maybe we'll get a little closer to pinpointing this elusive something that troubles us when we read fiction to our lifelong enrichment.